for making money in property in the UK. Hi, my name is Mark Lloyd. I'm co-founder of Property Master Academy, and I've been a property investor for over 15 years. For me, one of the best strategies when you're starting out is property sourcing and deal packaging. Why? Well, if you're investing for yourself, you're going to be looking for properties, you're going to be sourcing properties for yourself. And if you follow what we teach our mentees, you will find too many properties. So what do you do with the excess supply? Because let's say, for example, you put in offers on 10 properties and you're lucky enough to get 5 of those accepted. It's going to be very difficult for you to actually deal with 5 properties all at once. So maybe a better solution is to keep 2, possibly 3, but what do you do with the other 2? Well, I would suggest if you thought they were a good deal, there's plenty of other investors who will do so too. And that's where it comes into deal sourcing and packaging. And you can charge a fee depending on the level of service you're going to provide to that investor. From basic deal sourcing, where there's a flat fee, to actually providing a full package of not only just sourcing, but refurbishing the property and maybe tenanting it too. So deal sourcing is one of the foundation strategies for all other strategies in property, because it all starts with finding the property first. In terms of income from sourcing, well, that ranges quite dramatically. From a very inexperienced investor, you could earn maybe £1,500 to £3,000 for finding just one deal. That can stretch all the way up to 15, 20, 25,000, sometimes more, the more you can offer in terms of a service to your investor client. As a deal sourcer, you come under the Estate Agents Act, and as such, there are certain organisations you need to register with in order to be compliant. If you're a non-compliant sourcer, then you should not really be operating until you have these things in place. And there are 4 main things. Firstly, you should register with the Information Commissioner's Office to register for GDPR, data protection. Secondly, you need to be a member of a property redress scheme, and there's 2 main ones in the UK. There's one called the Property Redress Scheme, or the more popular one called the Property Ombudsman. Thirdly, you should also have professional indemnity insurance. And lastly, you'll need to register with HMRC for anti-money laundering purposes. Without those 4 things in place, you're not a compliant sourcer and you should not be sourcing properties for other investors. So please bear that in mind. But otherwise, from a very low cost startup, sourcing is a fantastic strategy for anybody getting started in property. It's the core strategy that leads on to the others. So let's get on to that first one, buy-to-let. Buy-to-let is often considered the foundation strategy for property investing and has been the mainstay for the past 30, 40 years. Fantastic strategy, works in many areas of the country, but it doesn't necessarily always work where the prices are high, particularly in the southeast and London, where yields are so low they're not much better than a basic bank deposit account. So buy-to-let property in the southeast, whilst potentially generating great capital growth, will provide very little in terms of an income return. The better buy-to-let areas are those where the property prices are cheaper, such as South Wales, the Midlands, North and Scotland, where you can get exceptionally good yields. Following on from buy-to-let would be HMOs, houses of multiple occupancy. Now, houses of multiple occupancy are where you're letting a house out by the room and consequently generating a much greater income than you could possibly achieve on a buy-to-let property. Of course, with higher income, higher yields generally means you're going to have higher risk too. Why? Well, HMOs, of course, you're dealing with that many more tenants than you would be on a single buy-to-let property. So that's really where the higher risk comes in. But if managed properly, it can generate a very, very good income over a long period of time. Popular HMO strategies would be, for example, maybe students, professionals, key workers, to name just a few. Leading on from HMOs, there's the rent-to-rent strategy. Now, whereas with HMOs you will need quite a large amount of capital to invest in HMOs, with rent-to-rent you definitely don't. And rent-to-rent has a number of sub-strategies within it. I'm going to talk about just 2 for the moment. First of all, the rent-to-rent HMO model, and then the rent-to-rent service apartment model. So rent-to-rent HMOs, very low startup and a very good way for someone starting out in property who wants to get experience of running HMOs and generate a really good income from it. We would expect on a basic rent-to-rent HMO to generate a minimum of £500 profit per month. On average, that will be around about £700, £750, certainly if you've followed any of our training. Very simply put, the rent-to-rent HMO is where you are taking a property from an existing landlord, that could be an existing HMO landlord, and then you are looking to rent the rooms out yourself and make a margin by providing that landlord with a hassle-free service where they get a fixed rental amount each month, and you take the hassle away from them. So very attractive to a lot of landlords. If we now look at the rent-to-rent serviced apartment model, very similar in the way it operates, although here, generally speaking, you're looking for smaller properties, 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom apartments, and there you're looking to do exactly the same thing. You're going to look to rent from a landlord, provide them with a fixed rental amount each month, when you take care of all the other aspects of renting out that property, and you keep the profit there too. An extension from rent to rent is lease options. In fact, a rent-to-rent contract in many respects is half of a lease option. So what is a lease option? Well, it's a very attractive strategy again because of the low capital input. A lease option is looking at a contract where you are going to offer to a potential vendor a way of them achieving their aims, whether now or at some point in the future, generally at some point in the future. Most lease option contracts will be in excess of 12 months. And the way they work very simply is you agree a price now that will be executed at some point in the future. And in the meantime, you have that management contract, so the rent aspect, where you are looking after the property, you're able to rent that property and retain the rental income and pay the landlord a fixed amount each month. Generally, that's just to cover their mortgage payment. The next strategy is short leases. So what are short leases? Well, if you're not too familiar with leasehold property, every flat in the country starts out as a leasehold property. And they vary in length. So most new leaseholds are generally between 99 and 125 years old. And all it means is as the age of that property increases, the lease decreases. And when the lease gets below usually around 70 years, it becomes very, very difficult to get a mortgage on that property. So you then have a dilemma for the vendor. What do? They can't now sell the property because most people want a mortgage and a buyer can't get a mortgage on the property because of the low lease. So following a short lease strategy is where you will help the vendor to sell their property by getting them to issue a notice to the freeholder, so that's the person that actually owns the building, owns the head lease if you like, and there'll be a payment mechanism involved there. What that amount is will depend on the length of the lease you're applying for, the current length of the lease that's left, and so on. So a number of different factors. Might sound a complicated strategy, but with a good power team behind you, can be very profitable. Of course, there are a number of changes happening within the leasehold market that the government's announced, and they should come into effect, so they say, sometime later in 2021. Next we have flipping properties. So flipping properties is essentially buying a property at one price, selling at a higher price and making a margin. You may add into that the buy, refurbish, refinance model where you actually add some value to the property, but basic flipping is just buying a property at one price and selling at another. Might sound, again, a little bit complicated, and it is quite a high-risk strategy, certainly for the newer investors, because if you're not sure of your exit on the property, then you could be left with a property you don't particularly want. I've just mentioned the buy, refurbish, refinance, rent model, often referred to as the BRRR. Very simply put, buying a property below market value, something that's tired, needs some work spent on it, refurbishing that property, refinancing it then to withdraw, hopefully, your refurbishment money and some of your initial capital, maybe all of your initial capital, and then rent out the property. A very good way of building a large portfolio of properties over a period of time. Lastly, and by no means least, commercial property. Now, commercial property is often misunderstood because it's not something that we come across in everyday life for the average investor. But once you understand commercial property, it can be extremely profitable. Commercial property comes in many guises, from offices through to retail outlets, through to commercial warehouse buildings, and so on. A lot of these fall into a commercial to residential strategy, where you're looking to convert a commercial building into residential property, or it could just be commercial property per se. In other words, where you're looking to get a commercial tenant into that property and generate an income. Now, the beauty of commercial property is, unlike residential, they have long leases. And these will generally be in excess of 5 years, often 10, 15 years. We've got a good quality commercial tenant in there, and it's almost set and forget because they have what's called a full repairing and insuring lease in most instances. So the tenant is responsible for repairs and insurance, and they pay your rent every quarter. So there you go. There's 10 strategies, 10 different ways of making money in property. Which is your favourite? Note it in the comments below. Love to hear from you. If you've enjoyed listening to this video, please hit the subscribe button and also the notification bell you'll see around this screen. Also, take a look at the videos that are now appearing on your screen, as they'll help you progress in your property journey.